Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to today's tutorial. Today we want to look at joints. Remember that joints, are formed when two or three bones meet at a point. These joints, can also be referred to as arthrosis, or they could also be referred to as articulations. That is why inflammation of these joints is known as arthritis. Yes, it could be osteoarthritis or it could be rheumatoid arthritis where it's autoimmune. Now, originally the concept of joints actually to permit movement as these associated muscles contract and relax. But some of them, yes, may be movable, and there will be that kind of variations or degrees of movement, even those which permit movement. Now remember that these joints, yes, we are saying that two or three bones are going to meet. But the degree of stability of such joints, actually apart from the articulating bones, also depends on the ligaments that are associated with it. Apart from that, even the tone of these muscles are going to play an important role as far as stability of these joints are concerned. Based on the degree of movement permitted at that joint, yes, therefore functionally, joints can be classified into three. We have those ones which do not permit movement at all, and they are known as synarthrosis or synarthrotic joints. We have those which are going to permit some slight movement, known as amphiarthrotic or amphiarthrosis, and then we have those which permit varying degree of free movement, known as diarthrosis or diarthrotic joints. Now, but structurally, joints can be classified into three again, based on the presence or absence of a joint cavity, as well as even the tissue that joins these structures, whether bones or bone and other structures together. Therefore, joints can be classified as fibrous joints, and in such a case, we have a fibrous tissue which is going to connect them, dense fibrous connective tissue going to connect them. We can also have what we call collagenal joint, where you have either hyaline cartilage or fibrocartilage connecting these usually bones. Then of course it could be synovial joint, where there's going to be a joint cavity, but there's also going to be the bones are not going to be physically connected, just like what we find in the case of fibrous joint as well as collagenal joint. So for collagenal joint and fibrous joint, there is no joint cavity, and therefore no synovial fluid will be present or joint cavity will be present. Now, if we take the fibrous joint, as we said, will be connected by dense fibrous, collagenous connective tissue. And if we take, examples, they include what we call the sutures of the scalp. So as you can see, these are the sutures of the scalp. Now, these sutures of the scalp originally, in the fetal life as well as early childhood, there's going to permit some slight movement, and therefore at that stage we can say that they are amphiarthrotic. But in adult life, it becomes fully fused, and actually it becomes synostotic. It gets fused together, permitting no movement at all. And in such a case, we say it is going to be synarthrotic. Now, the next one that we find will be syndesmosis. Syndesmosis being a type of fibrous joint. For syndesmosis, there could be some slight movement permitted, therefore they are amphiarthrotic. Typical example is going to be the middle tibiofibular joint by way of the interosseous membrane, as well as the middle radioulnar joints by way of the interosseous membrane. But in addition, we also have the inferior or the distal tibiofibular joints also being syndesmosis in nature, Now, the next fibrous joint that we find is what we call gomphosis, and for gomphosis is between the alveolar socket, these sockets, peg-like sockets, and these tooths, roots of tooth will have to fit in and form this joint, and they're actually going to fit there by way of periodontal ligament. This joint is actually originally we expect that it is synarthrotic, But in disease state, yes, it could be amphiarthrotic, as well as even in old age, yes, it could be amphiarthrotic. Now, having looked at these fibrous joints, the next joint which we are going to look at is going to be what we call collagenal joint. Now, we said that for collagenal joint, there's going to be that cartilaginous tissue going to connect these bones. And there are two groups of these joints. We have the primary cartilaginous joints, which can also be known as syndesmosis, and then we also have what we call secondary, cartilaginous, known as symphysis. Now, for the primary cartilaginous joint, mostly they are going to be synarthrotic. They are going to be synarthrotic. And the typical example, the first example that I want to look at is the first, sternal joint. Is going to be arthrotic actually, and this is an example of a primary cartilaginous joint. But remember that this primary cartilaginous joint is going to be the connection is going to be by way of hyaline cartilage. For secondary is going to be fibrocartilage, so hyaline cartilage. Now, another example that we find is with the long bones. So for instance, the long bones at their ends, there will be a fascial plate connecting actually the epiphysis to the diaphysis. That point, that cartilaginous joint over there, is actually known as, it's a primary type of cartilaginous joint. It's immovable, it is synarthrotic. But what happens is that yes, when their activity gets exhausted, then what happens is that this epiphyseal plate will be converted into an epiphyseal line, and therefore at that point we say there's synostosis that become bony. So that is that one. But in addition, even the xiphy sternal joint is also going to be arthrotic, actually by way of function, but structurally it's going to be a primary cartilaginous joint. Now, for the secondary cartilaginous joint, yes, there could be amphiarthrotic, permitting some slight movement, and these include what we call the pubic symphysis. Connecting these two oscoids, these two hip bones anteriorly. So there's the pubic symphysis. It's going to be a secondary cartilaginous joint. These secondary cartilaginous joints are normally found in the midline of the body. Yes, we also have what we call the symphysis menti, and usually it will become synostotic, it will get filled, become a bony. So this example, yes, we also have these intervertebral discs, which are also found in the midline of the body. Yes, these are also secondary cartilaginous joints. Remember that we have 23 of these intervertebral discs. So these will be some examples of these cartilaginous joints. But the next one, which is very important, which you look at the whiteboard, I will illustrate it on the whiteboard. We are going to have what we call the synovial joint. Now, synovial joint is the commonest type of joint that we are going to find by way of structure, and they are going to be diarthrotic. They are going to be freely movable, permitting various degrees of movement, internal rotation, external rotation, adduction, abduction, extension, flexion, all these kind of movement will be permitted. Now, if a synovial joint, yes, you could be uniaxial. That is, if you permit movement in one plane. You could also be biaxial if you permit movement in two planes. You could be triaxial, or usually we call you multiaxial, permitting movement in several planes. So that is what we are going to look at. Now, if we are synovial joints, what we are going to have is that there will be a joint cavity. There will be articular cartilages by way of hyaline cartilage, and then which will line the articulating bones, surfaces of articulating bones. Then in addition, we are going to have what you call a joint capsule. Now, importantly, the joint capsule, we have outer fibrous component and an inner. Outer fibrous component is actually made of dense irregular connective tissue. Then there's an inner portion known as synovial membrane, which is made of loose connective tissue, actually going to secrete synovial fluid, and helping to lubricate, take away waste, absorb shock and what have you at the joint. Now, if we have several categories based on the degree of movement and the shape of the articulating surfaces. Now, the first one that we are going to talk about is the plain synovial joint. Plain synovial joint, permitting gliding movement, and therefore, these examples, usually the articulating surfaces tend to be flat or nearly flat in nature, and there will be that kind of synovial fluid between them. So, examples, areas in the body that we are going to find these plain synovial joint. Yes, we saw that the first, coastal sternal joint was actually, chondrosis. But for the remaining, for the second up to the seventh, coastal sternal joint is going to be actually plain synovial joint. Yes, apart from this, we are also going to have even between the clavicle and the acromion, so acromioclavicular joint is going to be plain joint. Yes, even looking at the clavicle as well as the mandible of the sternum, we are also going to have the plain joint. So sternoclavicular joint is going to be a plain synovial joint. Then, of course, at the back too, there will be plain synovial joints. Yes, of course, between these ribs as well as the vertebrae. Costal vertebral joints as well as even costal transverse joints are going to be plain synovial joints. Yes, we also even have the proximal tibiofibular joint is going to be a plain joint. Proximal tibiofibular joint is going to be a plain joint. Yes, even the joint that is going to connect the ala of the sacrum to the ilium, sacroiliac joint is going to be a plain joint. So we have several of these plain joints, yes, in the body. So these are some examples of plain joint. Articular surfaces tend to be flat or nearly flat. Now the next thing that we want to look at is known as the hinge joint. Now remember that these kind of plain joints usually are going to be uniaxial, permitting movement in just a single plane. Now the next one that we want to look at is going to be the hinge joint. And for hinge joints, yes, they are also going to be uniaxial, but some of them could be biaxial. For instance, if you take the knee joint, yes, if you take the elbow joint, yes, if you take the ankle joint or the talocrural joint, they are also going to be hinge joint. So these are some examples. It's like the hinge of a door, so that permitting extension flexion to that degree. Now the next one, which is also an example of synovial joint, is the pivot joint. Now for pivot joint, you have a bone which fits into a hole, and usually that hole, which is provided by another bone, will be completed. It forms a ring, will be completed by a ligament, usually known as annular ligament, so that it forms a ring where the bone, and then it will permit that kind of rotation, and therefore pivot joints are also uniaxial. And for pivot joint, we are going to see the axial joint being an example, as well as the proximal and distal, radioulnar joints are also going to be pivot joints. Now, apart from these pivot joints, we are also going to have what we call the ball and socket joint. Now, for ball and socket joints, you have a rounded structure. For instance, so you have a rounded, articular surface going to fit into a socket, as we find here. Yes. So typical example of these ball and socket joints. Ball and socket joints are going to permit wide range of movement. They are going to permit abduction, adduction, extension, flexion, yes, even internal rotation, external. So they are multi-axial synovial joint. Typically, we are going to have the shoulder joint or the glenohumeral joint. It's one example. We're also going to have the acetabulo, femoral joint, which is, the hip joint. Is also a typical example of these joints. Now, the next thing that we are going to look at, is going to be the condyloid joint. Condyloid joint, and for condyloid joint, you have, somewhat concave, surface of a bone fitting, and then a convex shape, surface of a bone, fitting together. And so for condyloid joint, it's like condyle, sort of structure. Now, typically, we are going to find these condyloid joints between, so the wrist joint is actually condyloid in nature between, the radius and these, carpal bones. So, radiocarpal joints of the wrist, it's a typical example. Yes, even apart from that, we're also going to have these, what's the name? We're going to have these, so there's condyloid joint. We are also going to have these ones, which are, metacarpophalangeal joints. Metacarpophalangeal joints are also hinge joints. But remember that the intercarpal joints, are also hinged. Intercarpal joints are hinged. But we are saying that, yes, for condyloid, we are going to have radiocarpal joints. We are going to have metacarpophalangeal joints. Yes, we also are going to have, metatarsal, phalangeal joints as well, for being examples of these condyloid joints. Yes, even if you take the temporomandibular joint, it's actually, a condyloid, joint. But one thing that is, actually similar to these sort of condyloid joint, yes, remember that these condyloid joints are going to, be uniaxial, permitting that kind of flexion, extension. But you also have, for the first, metacarpal joint, that's between the trapezium and the first metacarpal, is going to be actually a saddle joint, because it's shaped like the saddle of a horse, so saddle joint. Typically you are going to find this one. And another example of saddle joint is this joint between the malleus and the incus. Yes, these ossicles of the ear. So incudo-malleolar joint is a type of saddle joint. Yes, some books refer to the sternoclavicular joint as being saddle. Yes, apart from being plain. Yes, some books also refer to it as such. So these are some examples. But remember that even these joints tarsal, intercarpal joint, they are going to be plain joints actually. So these are the various classifications of these joints. Now I want to complete this series actually looking at the structure, general structure of these kind of synovial joints. All right, so this is a typical structure of a synovial joint. Yes, so we are going to have these articulating bones. So this is the proximal or the superior articulating bone. This is the inferior one. But remember that where they are going to articulate, they will be lined by what we call joint articular cartilage. There will be an articular cartilage actually, so there will be one here as well. Now what happens is that, yes, importantly, we are going to have this structure which will have an outer fibrous component and an inner synovial membrane. So that together we form what we call the joint or the articular capsule. Joint capsule. So this joint capsule, yes, the synovial membrane is going to make this synovial fluid. But remember that the joint, the outer fibrous component, is actually made of dense irregular connective tissue, so that it can actually help in the stability of the joints in several directions. yes, there will be that kind of space, provided, which is known as the joint cavity, which will be filled by the fluid provided by the synovial membrane, by the synovial fluid. And remember that is why it is essential for you to warm up anytime you want to perform an exercise, because the synovial fluid can become congealed, and you have to warm it up so that it becomes light, so that you can move up with it. Now the next thing, yes, there could be other components, like if you look at the knee, we are going to have menisci as well. We have collateral ligaments here and there. So look at those videos of mine, in that regard. Those videos, I've done videos on the the shoulder joint, the knee joint, the hip joint. So let's look at those ones for better appreciation of the joint. All right, so this was a quick tutorial regarding these joints. I hope it's going to be helpful to you. Thank you very much for your audience.